Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, someone just tried to kill the president. It's being reported that they are dead, from X.com, posted by Moz the Prophet, and that looks like a tweet from linked to a tweet from Election Wiz, who tweeted, CNN, would-be Trump/Vance assassin is dead. And yeah, personally, I think that since this has happened, no one died. They found that the shooter didn't die either. But yeah, personally, I don't think it really matters. As I said in a comment on the anarcho-capitalism subreddit, some delusional redditor tried to take out Trump again. That's barely even news at this point. I think people are counting this as like the fourth major assassination against Trump, but you have to there's probably quite a few more that think it is for a lot of redditors out there, I would say. And yeah, this also ties into a post I made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I said, looks like someone probably, another delusional redditor, I said, what would happen if someone actually successfully managed to take out Trump? I said, looks like someone, probably another delusional redditor, tried to again at the White House Correspondents' Dinner last night. Personally, I don't think it would really change too much. People would either celebrate or mourn, depending on their politics, and then just move on to the next thing. Reddit would go from orange man bad to hillbilly man bad, and start going on about how Vance is so much worse than Trump, even though they have been calling Trump worse than Hitler for over a decade at this point. As I said earlier, though, it doesn't really matter. The president is mostly just a figurehead anyway. Trump might seem like an all-powerful entity because of the brand he created for himself, but I think that's more to remember that the ones with the real power in Washington are the ones who operate in the shadows. The deep state, FBI, NSA, CIA, and all the other alphabet agencies, military-industrial complex, and the special interest groups. Those are the ones who are really making the decision. Trump's just a WWE-style distraction for the rubes and the marks, so they can't they can't really pay attention to what actually matters. Ultimately, I would say that a lot of elected politics, that's just the WWE style distraction from what's really from who's really making decisions, the unelected deep state bureaucrats. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, if the 2028 Democratic presidential primary were held today, who would you vote for? Posted by Jacob Anders, and that's a cross post from the polls subreddit. And their options were Jacob Anders, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom. And yeah, personally, I'd probably go for Jacob Anders. I don't really know too much about him other than that he's posting a lot about himself on Reddit, and he thinks he's running for president. But ultimately, I don't trust the big corpo Dems, and I really want someone that the legacy media isn't covering, rather than someone that gets constant legacy media attention like Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has ruled that Texas can require public schools to display the Ten Commandments, a direct violation of church-state separation and a clear attempt to push Christianity into public education. Now, any school that gets donated to Ten Commandments posters must display them, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Religious Fruitcake subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, schools shouldn't be public in the first place. That means that gives the state too much power over them. Ideally, schools should be private, and if they want to display the Ten Commandments, they should be able to. If they want to display whatever they want, they should be able to. Ultimately, Reddit, they don't care that the Ten Commandments are being displayed, but they love when their ideology is displayed. If it were up to them, pride flags would be mandated in every classroom. I think that's important to remember as well. Ultimately, I think if a teacher wants to put Ten Commandments or a pride flag in their classroom, the teachers put whatever they want to. But ultimately, it's going to say that education is going to be kind of inherently indoctrinating people into your beliefs, and that's why I think libertarian position is to be very anti-education. Education is kind of, people should try learning for themselves rather than have the state teach them, and I think that's very much the libertarian position, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And next we have, who is praying for Trump, posted by China Military Secrets, and that looks like a screenshot from like Seinfeld or something. Did President Trump make it out there safely? And yeah, personally, I think if people want to pray for Trump, that's fine. If they want to pray against Trump, that's fine. Ultimately, I'm just tired of the whole Trump circle jerk, especially since it's been going on for over a decade at this point. Can we please move on to someone else already? And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, what's going on with the 11 scientists who have recently died or disappeared, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosspost from the Out of the Loop subreddit. And that looks like a link to an article from news.com.au. U.S. launches investigation after conspiracy over dead and missing scientists erupts. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for I don't think we should care about missing people, but ultimately it's just whatever the current media hoopla is. It's usually Orange Man bad or Epstein files or something related to Orange Man. Personally I hope they find the missing scientists, but ultimately it's just whatever the current thing is. People won't even pay attention to the missing scientists. There's so much other things to distract with people these days, and that just goes to show it's very much an attention economy. The media's always been an attention economy, but I definitely don't think it's ever been on quite the scale that's ever has been in regards to social media, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Rate My 2029 Libertarian Cabinet, posted by Jacob Anders, and they said, Secretary of State Rand Paul leads the shift to non-intervention, ending unconstitutional military aid in Palestine, global solidarity. Secretary of the Treasury Justin Amash audit the Fed, slash corporate welfare, military budget bloat, oppose bailouts, and push fiscal restraint funding any minimal humanity first experiments via cuts rather than new taxes. Secretary of Defense Thomas Massie delivers on endless wars, massive defense cuts, closing overseas bases, opposing blank check aid packages. Attorney General Ron Paul focuses on explaining the surveillance state, broad civil liberties, criminal justice decarceration, and holding corporations accountable through anti-authoritarian lenses rather than expanding federal power. Secretary of the Interior Mason Harrison Horde, never heard of him before. I've personally never heard of him before, but I don't know what. I've had OP seems like they have. Decentralized conservation via community land trust and mutual aid, ending fossil fuel subsidies through bottom-up approaches instead of heavy federal regulation. Secretary of Agriculture Dayton Martindale, I've never heard of, promotes food sovereignty for worker-owned co-ops, community support of agriculture, and rural mutual aid networks to support small-town revitalization without corporate agribusiness dominance. Secretary of Commerce Andrew Yang, personally I don't think he's that libertarian, especially with his UBI policy, but he's probably one of the better Democrats, I would say. Cuts regulatory catcher, corporate subsidies, and federal bureaucracy while promoting competition and anti-monopoly measures on anti-cronyism. Secretary of Labor Dan Pazzi, I've never heard of, emphasizes worker cooperatives, unionomy / self-management, and mutual aid structures for automation / job placement over top-down mandates. Secretary of Health and Human Services Mike Turmat, he was Libertarian Party nominee for Vice President in 2024, challenges big pharma monopolies for deregulation competition while supporting community-based mutual and aid health networks and voluntary alternatives. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Matt Kuno, I don't know if I've heard of him before, advances housing via community cooperatives, ending zoning barriers, and cooperate landlord power through bottom-up models. Secretary of Transportation Chase Oliver promotes competition transit, cuts inefficient federal subsidies, and supports rural access, green tech through market plus community approaches rather than mandates. Secretary of Energy Bill McKibben, Free50.org founder, with libertarian social symbol on decentralized renewables, advocate alternative or standard libertarian like subsidy cutting enough reformer from the LP orbit, energy reformer from the LP orbit, and fossil fuel cronyism / subsidies, and pushes community-owned decentralized clean energy experiments. Secretary of Education Kevin Carson, haven't heard of him before, shifts towards cooperative or community-run education, opposing centralized bureaucracy and corporate privatization. Secretary of Veterans Affairs Adam Kokesh ties directly into non-emergency for veteran crises as their source. Secretary of Homeland Security Alexander Kolokotronos, never heard of him either, drastically shrinks the department, opposes police state expansion, and prioritizes humane / decentralized approaches via worker rights and mutual aid. And personally, I think that sounds like a good cabinet from a libertarian perspective. Personally, I don't think it's probably going to happen. This guy probably has no chance of winning the Democratic nomination or the Libertarian nomination for that matter. But ultimately, we can only hope that so we get a more libertarian government sometime soon. Personally, I think the union's beyond saving at this point. But so if I were get elected, I probably wouldn't have a cabinet. I'd probably just try and dissolve the federal government and ride off into the sunset. Because at this point, I think the U.S. government, it's inherently unreformable. It grows regardless of which branch of the new party's in power, and the unit party is just going to be in power for the foreseeable future. So it's only just going to keep on growing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, in a rare interview, a leader of the world's largest right-wing group talks to NPR from NPR.org, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's crosspost from the NPR subreddit. And I don't know what group they're talking about, let's see what group it is. The group is an all-male Hindu nationalization called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Yeah, it's owned by the RSS. And yeah, personally, ultimately, if this person wants to talk to NPR, I think they should be able to. But ultimately, NPR, despite being government funded, and Reddit says, "Oh, don't trust the government," but they constantly cite NPR. But regardless, I think it's interesting. NPR, they consider probably anyone who dissents at all to be right wing. Right wing and particularly far right is very much just another outgroup category to the left, just like with fascist, Hitler, Nazi, chud, incel, etc. So when you constantly label any dissent at all right wing, ultimately you can label anything whatever you want to, but I think people are being tired of every any dissent at all being labeled inherently right wing. Reddit, it says, oh, being apolitical is right wing. Reddit probably says even being centrist is right wing. That's very much Reddit. And if you dissent from the woke leftist Marxist narrative at all, you're a right winger, regardless of how left leaning you might actually be. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have how we traced U.S. government gold to a drug cartel from nytimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, after over a year of work and more calls, more trade records, and a detour into 4 decades of legislative history, I figured out what's going on. It wasn't complicated. The U.S. Mint buys foreign gold and claims that as far as the law is concerned, it comes from the United States. For decades, Mint leaders have been using local logical gymnastics to call foreign gold American. They brought supplies originating in the Democratic Republic of the Congo from Mexican pawn shops and through South American brokers. A 2024 federal watchdog reports that the Mint had stopped asking suppliers about gold origins more than 20 years earlier. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, the U.S. government's going to fund, going to get gold from wherever it wants to get gold from, and if it wants to say it's from the U.S., ultimately, a lot of people won't have the ability to track where that gold comes from, and yeah, that's just very much how the U.S. government works. It's going to be inherently corrupt, and when it comes to obtaining raw materials and the like, and that's my thoughts there. Next we have, if the 2028 Democratic presidential primary held today, who would you vote for? Posted by Jacob Anders, and that's cross-posted from the Ideology Poll subreddit, where it allows 6 choices, blame them, not me, and their 6 choices for this poll was Jacob Anders himself, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, Mark Kelly, Gavin Newsom, or Josh Shapiro. And as I said, I'd probably go for Jacob Anders, mostly because, the mainstream media isn't covering him. He's really just posting on Reddit, and that's pretty much the only traction he's getting. And yeah, personally, I don't think he's probably going to take the nomination because the normie DNC wouldn't let him take it. But, ultimately, I think Libertarian position is, we got to get rid of these the uniparty and start forming our own parties and stop having so much corporate legacy media influence in the media, in politics. Let the people decide. Let people gain traction through social media, and let them be the new people ruling class, I would say. And that's my thoughts. The people need to rise or fall on their own merits rather than be pushed by legacy media, like pretty much everyone in this poll outside of the OP who just added himself in there. Next, we have disgusting. Dem reacts to GOP being split on a potential Ghislaine Maxwell pardon from YouTube.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the video subreddit, and that looks like a YouTube video from MS Now of the same name. And yeah, personally, I think Reddit, of course Reddit doesn't like Ghislaine Maxwell, but she was a power mod there for years, and they'll say, oh, that's a conspiracy, even though, the account conveniently stopped posting right when Maxwell got arrested by the FBI, and it just goes to show you that, Reddit is very much not as blameless in the whole Epstein files situation as it seems. Reddit, they'll say, oh, well, Jeffrey Epstein, he pushed the guy who ran 4chan to reopen up the politically incorrect board, but, Reddit is very much in the Epstein stuff too, and I think that's important to remember as well. The Epstein class is very much has roots in Reddit, but though, it's interesting, Reddit cares all about the people. Well, Reddit doesn't really care about Epstein too much outside of the Orange Man being connected to him, but, it's interesting, they feign support for the Epstein victims, all while using a website that the Epstein class was involved in, with Ghislaine Maxwell being one of the first users to reach 1 million Reddit karma. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have, if the 2028 election were held today, who would you vote for and why is it Afroman? Posted by Jacob Anders, and that's cross-post from the Polls subreddit. And Yeah, personally, I would probably go for the options are Afro-Man, Libertarian, Kamala Harris, Democrat, J.D. Vance, Republican, and personally, I'd probably go for Afro-Man. He seems pretty libertarian and he's pretty anti-government, so I'd probably go for him, or at least really small government. But personally, I don't think he'd have much of a chance of winning, especially as a third party, maybe as a major party. But ultimately, those major parties have pretty much shown themselves to be corrupt to the core. Like, Donald Trump marketed himself as an outsider, but he was just another GOP policy president. And I'm sure if anyone ran under the Democrat label, they might try and distance themselves from the DNC. But, they'll just be another DNC puppet in the White House, just like if Bernie would have won in 2016, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have finally attends correspondence dinner for the first time 10 days after judge rules can't build wall from non-safety reasons, posted by Fasty Ruinous 739, and that's cross-post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And yeah, and then looks like a meme from These Colors Don't Come, who has their logo in the style of the turning point. Trump is rushed off stage safe room where he checks his approval rating, and then the OPI politicians gonna do their thing. And yeah, personally, it might have been staged, but ultimately, I could go either way. Maybe it was staged, maybe it wasn't, but there definitely are enough delusional redditors out there to make me think it might not have been staged. Tons of delusional redditors want Trump dead. Maybe the next assassination attempt will come. It's barely even news at this point. There's so many of them. A lot of them don't get as far as the guy did, last night did, but just goes to show you that, I definitely do think one of these days they're going to be successful, I would say. Trump has to be lucky every time. His assassin only has to be lucky once. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So, we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.